Hello and welcome to a HR Grapevine webinar, this time with Propel International, which is the second in our run-through of now completely remote webinars. I'm your host, Dan Cave, Head of Content at HR Grapevine, and today I'm joined remotely, of course, in no contravention of the country's lockdown orders, by Kay Tia and Fleur Scott, who are both directors of consulting at Propel International, an award-winning talent assessment and development consultancy. In today's webinar, Kay and Fleur will take us through the importance of getting senior hires right, looking at ways firms can minimize risk when acquiring talent for the top end, which in the current changeable environment is going to be absolutely crucial in order for business to navigate at the moment, or as it stands, a daily changing landscape. Throughout the next hour, Kay and Fleur will demonstrate a data-driven approach to hiring senior managers, which looks at the increased effectiveness of using multiple objective assessment methods, and we'll talk through a case study too. They'll share key insights around the importance of knowing characteristics and behaviours that predict high performance in your organisation. They will look at an evidence-based approach to recruitment and how to develop a more robust assessment process for senior hires using multiple methods for greater objectivity. But before we get started in earnest, I will add, as with all of our webinars, please do send your questions through using the question function in the webinar app to put to Kay and Fleur at the end, and then they can answer and give some best practice tips. There will also, as ever, be polls throughout the webinar to test your knowledge and to get involved. And we will also be sending a recording of the webinar out afterwards. So don't worry if you're logging on late or only just hearing this now, the whole thing will be there. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Kay, who will take us through the first part of the webinar. Kay, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is a topic that we're really passionate about at Propel, and especially both Fleur and myself. We're all living in a strange virtual world now, and luckily data was already mainly virtual, but we're going to show you a number of the ways that you can still make sure that your senior recruitment process is really robust, even in these virtual times. The world may have changed since we first planned this webinar several months ago, but the message is as relevant now as it was then. Data-driven decisions are better, and now more than ever, we need to be making efficient and effective decisions about our senior leaders. So just to tell you a little bit about Fleur and myself, we've both got 15 years experience working with a whole range of different industries and sectors, specialising in assessment best practice. So we take it right through from the job analysis phase, understanding the different requirements required for success, and using a whole suite of assessment tools and methods to help companies select the best people and to empower people to deliver the best results. As Dan mentioned, we're a global consultancy. We've got several global offices and also a really great associate network that we draw on as well. So technology has always underpinned the work that we do at Propel, which helps us to deliver all of our assessments. You'll be able to see from this slide that we've got a number of household names that we're already working with. So people like Coca-Cola, who we used to run different online assessments with. And in fact, most of the clients that you'll see on this list work with us in some way to make sure that they're using data to make the best decisions for their organisations. So that's all I'm going to say about Propel. Just before we get really started into the webinar, I have to acknowledge the change due to COVID-19. Now, businesses are being forced to adapt in ways that are unprecedented. There's enormous pressure on leaders to exercise, correct judgment, but really to combine this with the compassion to make sure that employees still feel engaged. And all the while having to adapt to different, unique social and economic challenges that are being presented. It's a sad reality at the moment that as we get through this first initial phase, that there may be the need to restructure organisations, and that's going to lead to kind of increased pressure, complexity, and also stress. But one of the ways that senior assessment can help in this way is to make sure that you're making data-driven decisions to make really fair and legally bound decisions in any of those kind of fields. So senior assessment, we're talking about hiring, whether that's internal or external. It might be for promotions, promotion boards, for example, if you have that in your organisation. All of these benefit from taking a data-driven approach. We're going to start a little bit in terms of thinking about this business landscape, about the cost of getting it wrong. Now, I know we've got a lot of senior leaders on the line today, and you might be familiar with this, so we're just going to go through that quickly as a recap, because it really is critical that these decisions are right. Fleur's then going to take us through a look at the recruitment landscape, what we typically see clients doing, some of the common practices, and also some of the risks. I'll then talk to you a little bit about how we cultivate data, making sure that we're really getting the best use out of it, and we're going to finish with Propel's solution. So what do we recommend as the principles for making data-driven decisions? So what are the costs of getting it wrong at the senior level? So intrinsically, we'll know, either maybe we've worked in organisations where we've seen these kind of effects, but really recent research by Burton and Deloitte highlight some of the costs, the hidden costs, if you like, from recruitment getting it wrong. So we've got hiring and training costs, first of all, so they tend to be wasted. You know, we have that period where people need to get to productivity, and team and company performance can suffer. A bad senior manager can really create negative internal relations. You know, that can lead to turnover. Again, that's not good for productivity and morale. In terms of external relations, certain decisions might be made that can affect company reputation, you know, especially important now when companies and people are already, you know, suffering from a lot of stress and pressure. There's an effect on employee engagement. So as that goes down, you know, trust is lowered, productivity tends to be lower as well, and organisational culture. So a bad senior manager, a bad hire might not help you create the organisational culture that you're hoping for. Now, when we think about what the actual cost might be, the monetary cost, a poor hire at a mid-level, like a mid-manager role, can end up costing a business £132,000, more than that, even if they're on a salary of £42,000. But if we look at the executive level, actually what we see and the research shows is that the cost can be 5 times the salary and benefits. I mean, this is an enormous cost for businesses, and that isn't even taking into account what we talked about as also some of those hidden costs. So when we think about the high cost for getting it wrong, you know, can companies afford to ignore it? There's a clear business case for doing everything possible to get these senior hiring positions correct. So I want to hear a little bit from you now. I'm going to hand over to Dan, who's going to take us through our first poll. Dan, are we able to show our first poll? Okay, so what is your biggest challenge for senior level recruitment? It'd be great if you could select one of these polls. So is your biggest challenge attracting the right candidates? Is it selecting the right candidate for their capability? Is it selecting the right candidate for the culture? Retaining the right candidate? Or is it other? So please feel free to choose one of these answers and we look forward to hearing what you say. Okay, so a bit of a split here. So some of them attracting the right candidates. So that's interesting. Some selecting the right candidate for the capability. So those up ahead there, 31% each. So again, making data-driven decisions can help with both of these. First of all, for the right capability. So using different virtual assessments, we're going to talk about the whole person assessment. So the psychometrics already lend themselves well to being online, and as well you can do virtual assessment centres, as we really believe at Propel you've got to see someone using the behaviour if you really want to understand the capability. So I'm going to hand over to Fleur now, who's going to take us through the a little bit about the recruitment landscape that we see at the moment and some of the research.
Thank you, Kay. Hi everybody. Okay, so there's a wealth of research that demonstrates further the current recruitment challenges faced by organisations today. And here I'm just going to take you through 3 pieces of research that we feel is particularly important at this moment in time. Developing, promoting and hiring the right leaders is critical for businesses, especially since leadership quality is generally perceived as being quite low. This can often be due to inherent biases, which we will explore in the next section. However, we do know that when we get the hiring and promotion decisions right, it has a great and positive impact on performance. So firstly, according to Deloitte's Human Capital Trends study in 2019, we can see that 64% of companies reported that their biggest challenge is developing next generation leaders. The implication being that if they can't be developed internally, then they will need to be hired externally. So that's putting even more pressure on the assessment process, especially given the previous poll. One of the highest challenges that you've actually seen was selecting for capability. The next study is a study by the Conference Board in 2018. So this shows that only 30% of HR professionals report that their leadership quality is of a high quality. Interestingly, this conflicts slightly with the fact that 42% of actual leaders report leadership quality as being high. So the question we need to ask ourselves here is, who is right? The HR population, the leadership population, and how do they know? And who is making the hiring decisions? Is it HR? Is it a hiring manager? Is it the effective or less effective leader? The good news is, once you've found the right talent, the impact is clear. One study found that the relationship between quality of talent and business performance was dramatic, with a 400% productivity gap between high performers and average performers. So what does this all mean? As we've already mentioned, there is a new landscape, an ever-changing landscape, with new factors to consider. It's an increasingly complex world where the future is not so clear, especially now in the current situation that we're faced with COVID-19. We need leaders who can deal with ambiguity, who demonstrate agility and ability to adapt and learn from the past in order to drive future success. So moving on to the next slide. We've summarised some of the common recruitment practices that we often see in organisations. Firstly, we frequently see at Propel that the organisations that we work with often implement their most robust and in-depth objective assessment processes at the graduate level, but that there is a lack of understanding around the most effective assessment methods for senior roles, and a general sense that objective assessment methods should be disregarded at the senior level in place of putting a focus on prior experience and demonstrated past achievements. As a result, experiential interviews alone are often used at the senior leadership level. However, research, a huge amount of research, has shown that interviews alone are often ineffective, especially when these interviews are unstructured, and that past performance is not necessarily a good predictor of future performance. Part of the reason for this is that performance is hugely context dependent. Just because a leader performs well in one organisation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will perform just as well in a different organisational context, even if the new organisation is very similar and within the same industry. Performance is impacted by many things, such as the organisational culture, values, ways of working, as well as the skills, qualities and attributes of the leadership team that they work within, and also the team that they are being supported by. We'll now consider some of the common risks that we often see in the recruitment practices employed by many organisations that we work with, both large and small. Firstly, one of the most common risks is a lack of focus to the assessment process. By this we mean not having a clear understanding of what drives productivity and performance in your organisation. So what does good look like for you, for the role, for the organisation? Are you measuring the right things? Secondly, we often see at the senior leadership level limited inputs and limited data collection points during the assessment process. We will consider this in a bit more detail a little later on, but multiple assessments and measures are very important in order to assess the whole person. Blending different assessments from different test publishers if required, and combining this with one or more virtual or face-to-face behavioural assessments such as a structured behavioural interview or a simulation exercise will yield the best results and mitigate this risk. Another common risk is the quality of the output. So what is the quality of the assessment data that you collect? What does it tell you? Often we see organisations collecting data, but the data is not in a format that is meaningful or usable. Think about the situation when multiple outputs are generated. So for example, you might be using a Saville Wave professional styles personality questionnaire, a Hogan development survey, a cognitive ability assessment, plus an interview. How easy is it for you or your hiring managers to interpret and consolidate all of this information in a meaningful way against the specific criteria being assessed for the role? In addition, we see that clients are moving away from very lengthy, detailed feedback reports, where it's difficult to identify the key takeaways for each candidate. People are often not trained on making good data-driven decisions, even if the data is of a good quality in the first place. So, is the data being presented in a meaningful way that is relevant for the role being assessed against and your audience, and not only that, but the audience who are actually reading the feedback reports? Bias is probably the most common risk. As humans, people tend to think that we're better at choosing people than assessments are. If data is used, people often use it to confirm assumptions and decisions about candidates already made, especially if using an experience, reputation, or past achievement approach to assessment. Recently, we worked with a client as an example, who decided to overlook some key derailers which were flagged during the assessments because of the candidate's prior experience and past achievements. This candidate was offered the role, but the person's derailers in this new environment surfaced immediately, and they ended up exiting the role in the organisation after 1 week only. Subsequently, the person with less experience but who fared better in the assessments was then recruited and has since proven to be very successful. Last but not least, a real risk that we see frequently is this conflict of interest at the senior leadership assessment level. And that's especially when assessments are being used. If we're honest, it's very difficult to get a credible shortlist at the most senior level. So it can be perceived as being very risky by organisations to employ assessments that would potentially rule out these valuable candidates, by using assessments to sift people out of the process. But as Kay's already talked us through, we've seen the cost that a poor hire is far more damaging than actually waiting for the right person to fill the role. On the next slide, we've got a really nice quote which sums up the importance of leaders needing to be humble enough to appreciate when more information and data is needed to make better quality decisions, rather than just trusting our gut instinct. We know that emotional decisions are less effective, so now more than ever, especially in the current climate, where we're all under increased stress, we need to be leaning on data even more. We're now going to run another poll, and we're interested now to see which option you select in terms of what best describes the information that you use when recruiting your senior leaders.
Okay, so which option best describes what information you use when recruiting your senior leaders currently? Past experience and reputation, past experience and interview performance, interviews and psychometric personality tests, simulations, interviews and psychometric test scores, or other? So take a moment to just let us know what you're currently using. Here we go. So most people use past experience and interview performance, and that really links in with what we tend to see with the companies that we're working with as well.
Thank you,
Okay,
Kay.
let me hand back to Fleur.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. And this leads us nicely onto our next slide. We've mentioned multi-method a few times now, and I think what we've seen here, it's just really confirmed to us that some psychometrics plus an interview, it tends to be the most common approach taken for senior leadership hires. So the important takeaway here is that the more assessments used really do increase predictive validity. And even if a selection tool only marginally increases predictive validity, it will yield a high return on investment. So multi-method assessment is always best. We'll take a look at this later in terms of how Propel recommend creating whole person assessments. And granted, you know, it's not just about selecting any tool, it's about making sure that we are selecting the right tools to measure the specific success criteria identified for successful performance in the role and the organisation being assessed against. What's really interesting is that research has shown that blend of ability tests plus other tools provide the highest validities out of all other combinations. And yet organisations tend to shy away from such assessments, particularly ability tests at the senior level. So just to summarise then, in order to protect ourselves from risk and bias, we need to take an objective and data-driven approach to assessment, especially given that a surprising amount of organisations that we speak to are not using objective assessments at all, and specifically not for senior roles. I'll now hand back to Kay, who's going to speak a little about cultivating data.
Thank you, Fleur. So we've looked at the recruitment landscape, we've looked at some of the research and the evidence, and it's surprising that the amount of clients that we work with actually that still don't really trust that kind of data that they're not familiar with. Well, now I'm going to talk about how to cultivate useful data and how to use it effectively. But if we recap first of all about the importance of data-driven decision-making in recruitment, there are 4 key areas where we want to make sure that we're addressing. The first one is we want to maximise the chances of getting the right person for the role. As Fleur said earlier, the difference in performance can be 400% productivity increase. So just think about if your company had senior leaders all at that level, think of the difference that would make for your organization. So it's important to think about the people that you have now, understanding the traits and aspects that make people most likely to be successful. The second point is we want to maximise the chances of people staying. So we know that turnover is destabilising, especially at the senior level. Understanding the kind of traits and characteristics that make people stay within your organisation specifically can really help you to mitigate that risk. We want to minimise bias and maximise diversity in recruitment. So especially a lot of companies now starting to have different ratios that they need to achieve for diversity. So we want to be making sure that we're making great decisions that are helping the organisation get where it needs to be. And the last point is to ensure competence is identified over confidence. As you just noticed in the poll, that a lot of people at the senior recruitment level are tending to focus on interviewing. And what can happen when you just rely on interviewing and not data is you might start to select the candidates that are more articulate, showing confidence and that are extroverted. And they're not necessarily the leaders that are going to be the most competent and the best performers in your organisation. So it's definitely a risk that data-driven decision-making can help you avoid. So what's required for data-driven decision-making? The first thing you need to do is to identify and collect the right data. So you need to think about what is the question you're asking. So it could be, how do we recruit the highest quality leaders in our organisation? So once you know that, you can start to think about what data do I need in order to make that decision. The second point is that you need the expertise to translate the data into meaningful insights. What does it mean? What does it mean now and in the future? And the third point is that you've got to act on the data. So steps 1 and 2 are wasted if no action is taken. And this quote sums it up nicely. Data without insights is meaningless, and insights without action are pointless. If we dig a little deeper into a couple of these areas, is the right data always collected to help us make the right decisions? Well, no, it isn't, because we know that at the senior level, there's an over-reliance on past achievements, an overuse of interviews, a reluctance to use objective assessment. And here's another data point, a lack of outcome data. How often are you in your organisation really tracing how successful the candidates are being based on the recruitment process that you've used? But we tend to see that there's a lack of validation of the processes and the decisions being made. And is the data always being acted on? We do see that sometimes it's tick box exercises. So Fleur talked about the biases earlier. A common bias is the confirmation bias. So cherry picking the data that helps confirm the decision you want to make. So if you're using the data like that, then of course you're taking away the objectivity. But these biases, they exist within all of us, and we've got to be really vigilant to make sure that we hire the best people. And that last piece is to analyse the data to make even better future decisions. Once you start collecting this data and you've got it in the right place, you can really think about, are we recruiting the right people? How do we need to change our recruitment strategy or the methods? And also, what do we need to focus on from development or even from an attraction perspective? So the data should be giving you lots of insight to really help your organisation. So we've talked about cultivating the data and the recruitment landscape, and Fleur's going to start us off by talking about Propel's solution and some of our key principles for making data-driven decisions.
Thanks, Kay. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through Propel's 4 principles for data-driven senior assessment. The first critical step is to understand what needs to be measured. So what does senior level success look like in your organisation now and in the future? And that's very important. We need to take that future focus. So we know that senior level success is hugely context dependent. We've spoken about that already, and it can be influenced by many factors like culture, values, the attributes of the team around you and feeding into you, etc. That's why it's important not to only understand the success criteria required for effective performance in the specific role, but also the contextual factors which may also impact performance. We do this through the job analysis stage, where we work with key stakeholders to fully understand all of the factors that could contribute to effective or less effective performance in that specific role. To help define what needs to be measured, we use the Propel Leadership Potential model, which enables a whole person assessment process to be created. You can see here that there are 3 areas to this model, all of equal importance. Firstly, do the candidates have the capability, the cognitive capability, the cognitive horsepower to perform in the role? Can they do the job? Are they able to cope with the complexity of the leadership role that they'll be coming into? The second aspect is character. Does their character align with the requirements for the role? This is their preferences, their tendencies, and propensity to behave in a certain way. Will they behave in a way that enables them to be successful, and also in a way that is acceptable and will support the existing culture of the organisation? The third area is commitment. So this looks at the aspiration and the motivation and engagement of the individual to perform and grow within that specific role, and also within the organisation being hired into. It's not uncommon for individuals to want to take on a new role as the next step in their career journey. And if that's the case, they may not be fully committed to the specific organisation. And the best performers are people who really are going to go that extra mile and fully embed themselves, both in the role and in the organisation. This triangulation of data is really important, and you can see quite simply that without one or more of these areas, a leader just won't be as effective as they could be. But that said, it's very common for organisations to only look at 1 or 2 areas of this model without considering all 3. So we've already looked at the need to define what needs to be measured. The next step is the how. So how do we design a robust and objective multi-method assessment which is best positioned to elicit high quality data against the success criteria that we've identified in step 1? So at Propel, we recommend a blended assessment approach comprising of multiple virtual or face-to-face methods in line with best practice and research. Multiple methods doesn't necessarily mean it has to be extremely lengthy, cumbersome, or expensive. It's about selecting the right tools and processes for your needs and also for your budget. It could mean blending different online assessments from the same or different test publishers with an interview. But we often see that the greatest value added to any assessment process by simulation is by adding a simulation exercise. So a role play, a case study presentation, both of which can be delivered face-to-face or virtually. We also need to look at simplifying the outputs as well, so that they are easily used and are meaningful for the organisation and the individuals interpreting that. At Propel, we felt this pain ourselves, and we developed the Propel online talent portal. This has been designed to help our clients and partners simplify their online assessment processes by integrating with the world's leading test publishers and providing the functionality to create integrated output reports which consolidate data from different assessments into concise and meaningful feedback relevant to your organisation and the role being assessed. The talent portal is also set up to integrate with your chosen ATS or LMS or CRM systems through web services integration. The Propel Talent Portal also simplifies the process from an administrator and user experience perspective too. I'm sure we've all felt the pain of the traditional process. So traditionally, the assessment administrator has to log into multiple systems and online platforms if you're going to be using different tests from different test publishers for your assessment process. The candidate then receives 3 emails or more. They have multiple emails with their individual links to access their assessments. The candidate then has to log on to multiple platforms to complete their assessments on the test publisher own sites, and then that generates several different output reports, which will all be aligned to different models, making it difficult and time consuming to interpret, especially if you're combining that with another assessment like an interview or an assessment centre as well. So the new world is utilising the talent portal, Propel's talent portal, where you can see that the workflow is incredibly seamless and streamlined from both an administrator and from a candidate perspective. The administrator logs on to the Propel portal, the one platform, is able to set up an assessment, so a candidate is only having to be uploaded once, against an assessment battery that has been pre-selected of different assessment tools that the candidate needs to complete for this particular assessment process. The candidate only receives one email with one link, which when they click on it, takes them through an entire task list, seamlessly taking them through each assessment. Occupational psychologists at Propel then map the inputs across these multiple different areas across to the success criteria identified as being important for high performance, to create single, simplified, integrated feedback reports which consolidate the data from multiple assessments and interpreting it against the client-specific behaviours in client language, making it much more meaningful and much quicker and easier to interpret. So in addition to the more traditional detailed feedback reports that we create for hiring managers and also development feedback reports for candidates, what we found to be really useful is the presentation of candidate data in a simple, highly visual, at-a-glance format. So here's an example of a one-page talent dashboard report that we've created for a client previously. We produce these for talent boards and other internal stakeholders to provide very accessible information presented in a way that's meaningful for you and your organisation. I'm now going to hand back over to Kay, who's going to take you through the assimilation and analysis of the data.
Excellent. So we've looked at knowing what you need, creating the right assessment process, but what we found ourselves, and also what we see in a lot of organisations, especially those that have grown by acquisition, is that you might have a lot of data across multiple systems and multiple locations. So if you're using different test publishers, perhaps they have the raw data that, or the data that comes from the different assessments that they're providing, and you might have lots of different tools that don't align, and this is a common challenge for our clients. And it's one of the main reasons that we created the Propel Talent Portal. So as Fleur said, we're able to use the portal to set up suites of assessment tools, even if they're from different test publishers. We can also add different virtual assessment centre data or even face-to-face assessment data. So we can add different pieces in where you can store that data, and then you've got that stored centrally as well. And that can all be right next to the psychometric data. We can help create custom reports where you can add the assessor commentary into the system and it will produce it in terms of a bespoke report output. So it makes it look a lot neater and more finished than in traditional ways. What you can see in the Excel is that our administrators, they've got immediate access to all of the data that's stored on the talent portal. So from the click of a button, they can download the data, which can be used for all sorts of interesting analyses. So the last piece in our Principles for Data-Driven Senior Assessment is to analyse the data and generate the insights from them. To give you an example of what this looks like, this is an example taken from last year. We were working with a client on their director promotion boards. So they have several hundred people going through a suite of assessments, of which the psychometrics were the part of a second stage of a 4-piece assessment process. So we took that data, we looked at the overall decision, were they promoted or weren't they, and we were able to look and see if the data was telling us anything interesting. Now, this is an organisation that's traditionally been quite conservative, but really want to move the culture to be more innovative and more creative and helping the organisation move in a different direction for the future. However, what the data showed is that for every one unit, so one STEN on the psychometric, that people were more inventive, they were 14.3% less likely to be promoted. So this meant that even though they have an overall strategy, an aspiration to be more innovative, they're actually not promoting the people that will help them get there. So in this sense, the data is helping shine a light on problems within that system so that they can make changes and ultimately get closer to the type of culture and organisation that they aspire to be. So we're going to bring all of this together now, and Fleur's going to talk us finally through a recent case study where we were able to assess 3 different levels of roles within one of our clients.
Thanks, Kay. So I'm going to take you through, just very high level, this case study that comprising of a piece of work that we did for Business Stream recently. I'm more than happy to share the full case study which we've published with you after this webinar, should you be interested to see it. But just as by way of summary, we really believe at Propel that no one size fits all for executive assessment. And this case study really demonstrates how we adapted our process and approach to meet the specific assessment needs and budget of the client for each of these 3 different roles. So these 3 roles were very critical senior appointments for Business Stream. Business Streams, if you aren't aware of them, they're the 2nd largest water retailer in the UK and actually the largest operator in the Scottish non-domestic water market. They're a subsidiary of Scottish Water. So essentially we were asked to support them for the 3 different assessments for these 3 different roles. Interestingly, the Chief Operating Officer role was a completely new role, never been in place before within Business Stream, and would be directly reporting into the CEO, who was our key stakeholder throughout this entire project. In each case, you can see we utilised multiple assessments, and with the most in-depth assessments used at the most senior level, which obviously in turn carried with it the most risk in terms of if we were to get that wrong. So if we talk through just very quickly for each of the different approaches. So for the Chief Operating Officer, it was a very ambiguous role. It was new, it was going to be quite complex. They would be involved in a lot of strategy development, working in a new environment and quite a challenging situation. So we created a process which actually utilised the cognitive process profile, which looks at an individual's ability to actually be able to, or how they actually approach the cognitive processing of information when they are under pressure and when in highly ambiguous situations. It also gives you an indication of how an individual is actually going to be able to deal with new situations and gives a direct measure of learning agility also. For all of the different roles, we had a blend of personality and other online psychometric assessments, with then a follow-up assessment for the Chief Operating Officer and Head of Business Transformation. It was a half-day assessment centre, and the Head of People Development was a 1.5-hour deep dive psychological interview. The 3 roles varied. There were varying budgets, there were varying needs. With regards to how these were delivered, the Chief Operating Officer was all face-to-face in terms of the assessment centre. The Head of Business Transformation, it was designed, the assessment centre was designed to be face-to-face, but actually circumstances meant that one candidate actually wasn't able to make that face-to-face meeting. We were able to very quickly translate the exact same assessment and deliver it in a virtual format via WebEx. The Head of People and Development was slightly different. There was a much lower budget for this role, but also the candidates were spread very widely geographically, and it was really impossible, especially with the timescales for this specific role, to get everybody in one place. So what we did here to complement the online psychometrics is a 1.5-hour deep dive psychological interview, and we did that via video Skype, so that was delivered virtually as well. I just want to highlight with regards to an assessment centre, so there's often a really common misconception that assessment centres can be really expensive and resource intensive, and that simulation exercises either need to be fully custom, or if they're bought off the shelf, they might not be fit for purpose for that particular organisation or role. So what we did for Business Stream was combine an off-the-shelf stakeholder meeting role play exercise with a bespoke business case study exercise. We developed that in conjunction with stakeholders at Business Stream, where they identified a real-life current problem that was facing the business. We then posed that to candidates a week before their assessment, asking them to think about the problem and to present and create a presentation that they would then present to us on the day in terms of their recommendations for action. That was really insightful, and Business Stream really valued that part of the assessment because it gave them an insight into how an individual might approach this current problem and situation should they be successful in coming into the role. So if we just flip over on to have a look at some of the feedback that we received for this project. This is what the Business Stream CEO had to say about the process. She was really happy with the outcome, and she was particularly pleased with how all successful candidates not only have proven to be a great fit for the role, but also for the organisation and culture. I'm going to hand over now to Kay for a very quick recap before we go on to cover our Q&A session. I can see some very good questions coming in already.
Okay, so just to summarise, we are in challenging, unprecedented times at the moment, and they require us to have the highest quality senior level leaders in the organisation. The evidence and research shows that decisions made with multiple data points are the best ones for predicting success, and we can support you in identifying a really robust virtual senior assessment process. You know, we're all working from home now, but that doesn't mean that the robustness or even the assessments have to stop. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to have time, about 10 minutes now, for a Q&A, which might be hosted by Dan, but he's having a few sound issues. So we'll just see if he is able to.
I am back. Can everybody hear me?
Brilliant.
Is that good? I was
Okay.
very embarrassingly kicked out of my own webinar. Was my own webinar. The webinar is hosting by the system, so apologies to our audience, and thank you for Kay to be very, very quick on the upstart to host the polls. Another quick thank you to Kay and Fleur for taking us through essentially a more data-driven and objective approach to senior recruitment. Afterwards as well, they will be sending out that case study as well from Business Stream. So if you have any follow-up questions, please do get in contact after we've sent out the recording of this. Before we finish though, as Kay said, we have got some questions, and I can see quite a few of you have sent them through. There's a good one that I think I'm going to put to Fleur to kickstart the Q&A session, which is, what's the minimum amount of assessment you think we should be doing at the senior level? So Fleur, would you be able to take that one?
Absolutely, thanks Dan. And that's a question that we get asked frequently. So in terms of, you know, the minimum, it's really looking at, if we think back to the Propel leadership potential model, we need to be looking at capability, and we need to be looking at somebody's actual personality and the behaviours they're going to bring to the role, and also their commitment to the organisation. So I think as long as we bear in mind that we're needing to create a process that we are actually able to pull all of that data out, and ideally to triangulate that data as well, we would always recommend a blend as an absolute minimum of online psychometrics and a deep dive, well-designed, structured, behavioural rather than experiential interview. That allows us to really pressure test some of the outcomes from the psychometrics and really align that with you know, the individual's evidence that they're able to give for their experience. Now, bearing in mind that interviews just aren't the most predictive on their own. So we always see that if you can stretch to it, even adding that business case study where you can create very simply a real life problem and present that to the individual and see how they would actually deal with that issue, what recommendations that they would make. Having that one-to-one interaction which allows you to assess the behavioural component of the candidate and what they're able to bring to the table under pressure in the moment, we find that as being really valuable.
Thank you very much, Fleur. On the same topic of assessment, but slightly differently, can I put this to you, Kay, which is, out of all the online assessments, what would you say is the most stretching assessment for leadership potential?
Okay, and no problem. So there's one tool which Fleur mentioned that we use for Business Stream, and one tool that we find that I think every single person that's gone through it that I know has found it a real stretch, regardless of how they performed on the assessment, and that's the cognitive process profile. So this is quite a unique online assessment. It takes between 1 and 3 hours to complete. Participants, candidates, they go through a series of 8 exercises. It's very hard to explain because the system is tracking the thinking processes as you go through these tasks. And ultimately, you get a couple of interesting pieces of data. I mean, a big long report, but a couple of the really interesting ones to pull out is the type of environment that the person is most likely to thrive in. So it ranges, there's 5 levels from pure operational at one end to pure strategic at the other end. So again, this is just talking about the level of complexity that someone is able to handle. The second piece, which we find really useful, is there is a specific learning potential score here. So that's something you can compare really clearly across candidates to see which candidates are most likely going to be able to adapt, learn new challenges, and really take that forward to help the organisation achieve its goals. So yeah, we would say the cognitive process profile, but as Fleur said, no assessment should be used alone. They should all be used to get a whole person assessment.
Thank you very much, Kay. I guess then on the flip side, once the assessment has been made and someone has been hired into the position, how could you help organisations to evaluate that they have made a successful appointment? Fleur, can I put that to you?
Absolutely, and that's a question that we would love organisations to ask us more. You know, it's generally something that we don't get asked to do a lot of, and we really welcome that, because not only does a validation help the organisation build a business case for robust assessment for the future, but it allows us to really be able to see actually how effective has this process been, and actually does every element predict success on the role? Can we start to think about refining the assessment process? So we have done it in some cases. We have done some validation studies when the organisation has the performance data that they're able to give us to then be able to conduct some validations around, okay, so which factors are most predictive of success in the role, and which stages in the assessment process as well are helping us to actually elicit these effective behaviours most effectively. Kay, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, but I'd agree with you. I think it's something that gets missed. I think that organisations, you know, good, we've made the hire, now we're moving on, and there's so much scope to check the data, check the decision, and keep learning and keep improving the processes, but we don't see that a lot in organisations. So yeah, if you're interested and you want, please reach out to us. We'd love to get involved in that kind of work.
Thank you. And I think there is time for one more, and I think it's around buy-in for the extended nature of adding different assessments to what companies might have traditionally done as just an interview. How do you get buy-in from the candidate to help them understand that this is worthwhile, and also the business itself?
Yeah, this is tough, and especially for the CPP, which, as we say, it can be between 1 and 3 hours. So if you add that on to another suite of assessments, maybe there's some online assessments, maybe there's also, as Fleur said, a face-to-face simulation, that's a lot of investment. But what we talk to organisations about is to let candidates know upfront that we are hosting a really objective, fair assessment process that we want to make with data, because we want it to be as fair as possible and really get the right candidate. And we find that different candidates, when they understand that, they're motivated to want to take part in that kind of assessment. The people that aren't, that's telling us something straight away. And we do have organisations that come to us and say, we really want this candidate to apply, but they said they won't go through the assessment process. And that is a decision for the organisations to make. But what we can only say is that all of this research says that you should be using data. So, we really kind of question how invested people are in the role if they don't want to go through the assessment processes.
Thank you very much, Kay. So unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. However, you can follow up with us and Propel afterwards when we send out the recording of this webinar. And as mentioned previously by Kay and myself, that case study would be available in full. Please look out for future webinars that we'll be hosting in the coming weeks and months. And a big thank you to both Kay and Fleur today for sharing their expertise on this increasingly important subject. And a thank you to yourselves, our audience, for tuning in. So I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.